Very good. Well, please tell us a story.
Hi, I'm Jim Cassane. I'm with the Tampa Bay Storytellers Guild, and I'd like to tell you a historical tale this evening. In the 1880s and 90s, it was a time when the citizenry nationwide was all abuzz about this new innovation called electricity. It was an electrifying time indeed. Charles Brush of Buffalo was one of the early pioneers in the development of electric arc lamps. In July of 81, the Brush Electric Light Company had installed the first electric plant in Buffalo, and by many accounts, created the first street in the country that was illuminated with electric lights using early carbon arc technology. But the street that they chose was really a heavy industrial area with a lot of factories and warehouses and railroads. And the need for illumination was because these facilities operated very busily overnight. But the race was on. Other cities started getting and installing these first generation carbon arc lamps. And likewise, they were most often found in industrial settings because they were very, very hot. They made loud hissing and popping sounds, were notoriously unpredictable and unreliable, and they proved difficult to service. But the stage had been set for an innovation in carbon arc lamp technology to replace these expensive, temperamental, and cumbersome light sources. And that innovation appeared in 1893 when the Hartford Electric Company turned up the heat by announcing the nation's first enclosed carbon arc lamp that was to become the new standard for municipal street lighting. Hartford Electric had quickly built upon the early ideas of Thomas Edison about ways to harness the potential of electricity. Showcasing this announcement, Hartford was aggressively installing these new and improved enclosed carbon arc streetlights. They boasted in the press about how they made the city glow like daylight throughout the evening hours. But even these new enclosed carbon arc lights ran very hot, burning through the carbon electrodes that needed to be serviced every 2 or 3 weeks. Now, the city had placed a help wanted ad looking to employ several more electrical service workers. Enter fearless young Spencer, who at age 17 was ready for the challenge of learning how to change the carbon electrodes in these enclosed street lamps. He was the very first one to show up in person the next morning and became one of the first people hired. Now, mind you, it wasn't a job for everybody since electricity was still unknown and many people at the time feared it, terrified of electrical shock. Even President Benjamin Harrison, who in 1891 had approved installation of electric lighting at the White House, refused to touch a light switch for fear that he'd be electrocuted. So now in 1893, there was little documentation or published knowledge about electricity. And so the early electrician was considered by the general population a fearless, daring cowboy on this new frontier, not afraid to risk life and limb in order to figure out how to work with and tame this beast. Okay, maybe tame is a little bit of a reach. These fellows were more often than not daring electrical experimenters who relied on common sense, gut feel, and more often than not, hearsay from their fellow electricians who themselves were learning the ins and outs of electricity. Now, being one of the first new hires and having more experience working with these new streetlights, young Spencer became known pretty quickly as an expert in street lighting. Often the person at Hartford Electric Light would send out when they had some significant or difficult repair work to be done. Now, mind you, at this time, there was no electrical test equipment per se. And Spencer would often take a section of electrical cable and he'd scratch it against the metal pole to see if the cable was hot. If it was, it would create a huge shower of sparks. And that is how Spencer got the nickname Sparky from his coworkers. Now, on this particular afternoon in the summer, Sparky was repairing one of the carbon arc streetlights when he managed somehow to get in the middle of a live high voltage circuit. It threw him backwards off the basket that was sitting atop this 20-foot step ladder. And the powerful jolt of high voltage was enough to kill any man. But as his limp and lifeless body fell downward, it landed on another live wire that touched his exposed neck, taking a second major electrical shock before depositing him face down on the grass below. Bystanders, seeing what had happened, gathered quickly, but nobody wanted to touch him for fear that they'd get electrocuted themselves. And a local doctor quickly arrived on the scene, took his stethoscope and placed it on Sparky's chest and said, "There's a faint heartbeat." And shortly thereafter, Sparky's eyes opened up. Apparently, the second jolt of electricity had revived him after the first jolt had caused his heart to stop. And he was taken to the hospital for observation and treated for some burns. But the newspapers got hold of the story of this modern day miracle and published it both locally as well as nationally. And as Spencer recuperated, he decided being an electrician was far too dangerous a job, and it was time to change careers. And if he was ever going to have a normal life, this was the time to do it. A local railroad man heard about this wish and came to the hospital and offered Spencer a position on the New Haven Railroad, which he said would pay pretty well and was far less dangerous than working with electricity. Well, it didn't take much for him to accept that offer, and Spencer found himself much happier and put in the next 25 years working on his job at the railroad. As an electrician, Sparky risked life and limb with electrical equipment, but as Spencer, each day he went to work in the rail yards, switching tracks and connecting cars. And eventually he had enough seniority build up to bid on a job working on the passenger trains. This was much more to his liking, and he was a pleasant fellow. He had a great demeanor and helpful, noticed by all the passengers and rewarded as well by company management. His regulars described him as having a warm, generous, magnetic heart and smile and a cheerful personality. And even in the coldest of Connecticut winters, the passengers on the trains where he was aboard felt that he warmed their hearts and made the difficult trip much more bearable. And it was in that role that he retired years later from the New Haven Railroad. However, his retirement was short-lived, as over the years he had developed a few serious health issues, and he passed away quietly at home 2 years later. He's currently buried at the courtyard of St. Stanislaus Church in East Hartford, where a simple granite headstone marks his grave. Now, if you knew the story of Spencer, the epitaph that's carved on his simple headstone would be like a set of bookends that connected the beginning and the ends of his career. Those who had come to know him personally in Hartford knew that he had gone from a pioneer electrician risking his life daily to a highly respected and beloved railroad employee, always there in the service of others. But the inscription on his headstone also conveys the nuance of both ends of his life. Inspired, and carved into the gray granite, all you see is, all in all, Spencer was a very good conductor.
Ah.
Thank you.